and yet we might want to capture things that exist in federal lands. How do we integrate our policies? How do we integrate what we do? And so it presents many challenges to us, but we're committed to working with the legislature, working with the other agencies, working with stakeholders in the context of a broader program to accomplish greenhouse gas emissions in what we might do even without cap and trade monies, and how we enlist other agencies so that we can do it as well. So that's sort of in capsule what I wanted to say today, and I know that Secretary Ross is very anxious to speak to you, so I will turn it over to her.
Senator Penn and I thank you, Secretary Laird. Secretary Ross, welcome.
I'm so anxious to address you today that I'm stepping in front of my good friend and colleague, Randall Winston from the Strategic Growth Council. Thank you very much for your time and attention for just a few minutes today. I'm going to talk about what the governor has proposed for the budget this year, which is $75 million to the Department of Food and Agriculture for climate-smart agriculture. This is not a terminology that we've made up here in California, but we should have made it up here. It actually comes from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, who has been spending a lot of time in this decade really trying to understand how do we meet the food needs of a fast-growing world population, which is estimated to add an additional 2 billion people by the year 2050 with a smaller environmental footprint. We must improve our productivity, our efficiency, and do it in a way that minimizes our impact to the environment. And that is how the terminology of climate-smart agriculture was developed. We're very fortunate to have an excellent partner on climate-smart agricultural practices in the United States Department of Agriculture and its Natural Resources Conservation Service. We've had some experience with 3 of the programs that are under climate-smart agriculture. The first one is our state water efficiency and enhancement program, which actually was created in response to emergency drought legislation. In 2014, the legislature and the governor worked on a package of emergency measures to improve water efficiency and to try to mitigate the impacts of drought in our rural communities. $10 million was made available in 2014. Another $10 million was made available in 2015. And in the Budget Act last year, an additional $40 million was made available to the department to implement this program. Our experience to date is that this is a very popular program. It is oversubscribed by 300%. We could give away hundreds of millions of dollars to improve water use efficiency on the farms. It's important to note that over 50% of our irrigated acreage is already under some sort of precision irrigation technology, which means there's still room for improvement. And I think the response to this program has demonstrated that. We have awarded almost $18 million to 233 projects. And to stress what you've heard from my previous speakers, and Secretary Laird, you did a great job of giving the macro understanding of the metrics that we have to meet in order to qualify for these programs. They've been developed in conjunction with the Air Board, but also with our university partners. So we have calculated that these first 233 projects for 2014 and 2015 have added almost 44,000 acres under precision irrigation technology. They are calculated at this point to save 37,488 acre-feet of water per year, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 54,695 million metric tons, 54,000 metric tons. The way that we go about doing this program is the first time that farmers were asked to calculate what their greenhouse gas emission reductions would be. And so it became important to find a calculator tool to help them with that, which had been developed by the United States Department of Agriculture. We have worked with them to make sure that there's technical support in place to the resource conservation districts to assist them, in addition to our very important partners at the Cooperative Extension through the University of California. When the grants come in, they are scored by objective third-party scientists from both the UC and CSU system to make sure that the documentation that they've provided, which is based on their previous year crop, water use, and energy use as the benchmark for how they're going to calculate what the savings will be. And these researchers score these projects for us and then bring them back to us to make the awards. We are required to go back and do audits and spot verifications and collect their documentation, which right now is primarily tied to energy use, is one of those requirements that we look at for 3 years to make sure that over the 10-year lifespan of this project, we will continue to get those kinds of reductions. So that's our state water use efficiency program. The other program that we had experience with in 2014 with funding from the legislature was $12 million for our dairy digester and research program. This is an important program because it's about achieving reductions in methane, which is a criteria pollutant and a short-lived climate pollutant. That $12 million, of that $11.8 million went to 5 projects in the state. We required matching funds. These are expensive investments in technology, trying to make sure that we're doing the best job we possibly can. All 5 of those projects were in disadvantaged communities, and I want to note that well over 25% of our water use efficiency programs have been in disadvantaged communities. And a benefit of that is that the installation of a lot of this kind of technology has created jobs to mitigate job losses caused by the drought. So where there weren't seasonal farming jobs, there were putting in irrigation systems and technologies that offset some of those job losses. So we've been able to cite 5 of these programs. We calculate that they will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and methane reductions 1.37 million metric tons over a 10-year period. We are very excited that the governor's proposal would provide an additional $35 million. There are multiple benefits here. These do add jobs in these communities. In addition to reducing the methane issues that we have, they're producing alternative energy, and we are especially optimistic about the use of dairy digester technology for low-carbon transportation fuels. So we look forward to building an even bigger infrastructure in the state where all of our dairies still are. I can't do anything about the prices yet, Dr. Pan, but this is an important alternative revenue stream for dairy farmers. The third program that is proposed under the $75 million budget allocation is $20 million for our Healthy Soils program. Now, many people scratch their head and go, healthy soils, what does this have to do with climate-smart agriculture? Soil is, in fact, the foundation for being as productive as we can be, and investing in our soils to improve our soil health, sequester carbon, and improve soil organic matter helps us with adaptation and resiliency to climate, and most importantly, improves water holding capacity, so it helps us with our drought resilience moving forward. The only practices that we will be able to use under this, like compost, like no-till farming, as 2 examples, cover crops, crop rotations, will be those farming practices that the United States Department of Agriculture has been able to quantify scientifically as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We are partnering with USDA to help them add more of the kinds of practices that are unique to our specialty crop sector here in California, so that we can, over time, add additional practices that will achieve the kinds of co-benefits that we know are possible with this program. So I want to thank you for your attention. I want to commit to you that we are very married to meeting the metrics of this program, as our friends at the Department of Finance can assure you of, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about how we keep California agriculture the most productive and the most environmentally sound that's on the continent as well as on the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Director Winston, you're up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members, as well. I'll try to be brief in the interest of time here. I know folks are eager for questions. Again, Randall Winston with the Strategic Growth Council. I want to touch upon just 3 programs with the Strategic Growth Council. Our Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, a pilot program actually funded last year, providing technical assistance to disadvantaged communities who are applying to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. And then a new proposed program, which you've heard about a bit, Transformational transformational climate communities. Before I do that, though, just a word on the Strategic Growth Council for those who don't know who we are. We actually consist of 10 members, 3 public members, one appointed by the governor, one appointed by the Senate and the Assembly, as well as 6 cabinet secretaries, 4 of whom are right here, and the director of the governor's Office of Planning and Research. And our charge really is to coordinate the activities of state agencies to assist state and local entities to advance sustainable communities and the goals of AB 32. So with that, on affordable housing and sustainable communities, $400 million for that program is proposed. This is a program also that had a first cycle in 2014 to 2015. This funds projects that result in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled through land use, housing, transportation, and agricultural land preservation practices that support infill and compact development. At least 50% of the funds benefit disadvantaged communities, and at least 50% of the funds also go to affordable housing. Now, last year, just to illustrate some of the outcomes and achievements, some of my colleagues did earlier with other programs, over 700,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions were avoided, equivalent to over 140,000 cars off the road. Over 70% of the funds benefited disadvantaged communities throughout the state, including over 2,000 units of affordable housing. Some other co-benefits in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and all of this data is publicly available at the moment. Benefits including reducing housing, transportation, and energy costs, bringing jobs and housing closer together, creating jobs, improving health by reducing air pollutants, and increasing access to parks and green space. For 2015, 2016, similar sort of setup here. As part of the Sustainable Communities implementation, the program has really 2 components. One, affordable housing and sustainable communities, which funds projects that I mentioned earlier, and also sustainable agricultural lands and conservation, which includes 2 elements, agricultural easements as well as strategies and outcomes. Projects here really protect at-risk agriculture lands from conversion to more GHG intensive uses in order to promote growth within existing jurisdictions, ensure open space remains available, and support a healthy agricultural economy and resulting food security. And we work very closely, of course, with the programs mentioned earlier by Secretary Ross. Now, all of that being said, we recognize the need to better prepare disadvantaged communities to maximize greenhouse gas reductions and achieve other co-benefits. Last year's budget appropriated a small amount of funds, just $500,000 for a pilot program to provide technical assistance for 68 disadvantaged communities who applied to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program but were unsuccessful. And so it's assistance that will be provided in the current cycle. It's a focused scope intended to maximize funding and really learn what works best. Contracts were awarded to third-party providers regionally, including in Southern California, the San Joaquin Valley, and a combination of the Bay Area, Sacramento, and San Diego, and includes assistance for project proposal development, application completion, capacity building, and evaluation. Finally, wanted to touch briefly on the new proposed program, Transformational Climate Communities. And let me just start by clarifying, I think the intent here is to really have a public discussion about the program and its specific components, so we are eager to hear your thoughts. As referred to in the proposed budget and others earlier, including Mr. Almy, the program supports innovative approaches to target disadvantaged communities through local efforts. Specifically local climate actions in the top 5%. So we have a focus on the most disadvantaged communities as well as local climate action, really projects that integrate multiple cross-cutting approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A couple of elements that I would like to highlight again being considered insofar as local partnerships. These are partnerships that would bring a community-based multi-sector commitment to a shared vision for developing and deploying transformational projects. And what's meant by transformational projects, again, eager to hear input, but these are neighborhood scale, integrated projects that drive innovation and accelerate greenhouse gas reduction, such as district-wide energy, water, resource and waste management, zero-net energy buildings and green infrastructure, active transportation networks, and more, while also increasing job training, economic, health, and environmental benefits. So with that, thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Winston. We've got a number of senators who have questions for you. I'm going to start off. I'll address this first question to Mr. Almy, but anyone can join in as you like. With one of the first points that Mr. Brown made, that if we continue to use these cap and trade dollars to invest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions with the 85% of the sources of emission, that could potentially then free up their use of their allowances to other areas where there are emissions ongoing, and that there may be a question as to whether we are in fact overall reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If that's not a concern to you, how do we document that it is in fact not a concern?
Thank you for the question. I think the key element there is that all of the expenditures proposed here will result in emission reductions. I think the point that the LAO is raising is that what that might end up doing is kind of changing the balance of where the emissions come from. And in that case, if you leave it to just the cap, that it would more likely be more cost effective. So you would achieve more cost-effective emission reductions just leaving it to the cap than you otherwise would. And I think the point that I was trying to make in my comments is that, and even Secretary Rodriguez alluded to this, is that there are co-benefits associated with these expenditures that aren't necessarily going to be reflected in the market price. So what the LAO is suggesting is that, well, if you look at it from a pure cost effectiveness perspective, the cost of the emissions reduction would be less than if you reduced it through an expenditure. I think our point is that there's larger co-benefits. So let me use the Forest Health program as kind of an illustrative example. I see that as has six dimensions of benefits. One, you get emission reductions through carbon sequestration from the trees. Two, you avoid additional emissions associated with the wildfires. Three, you have a public safety benefit by reducing the risk of severity of wildfires. Three, you could get some biomass renewable energy benefit associated with it. Five, you would get some economic job creation benefits in rural areas associated with the tree removal and the biomass. And six, you also get water quality benefits. So if you look at all of the different co-benefits associated with that expenditure, you can't just look at it purely from the emission reduction perspective. You have to look at it holistically. And that's kind of how we think about all of these programs working together.
Good evaluation, thank you. There was appropriately repeated mention of investment in disadvantaged communities. And I know we've had this conversation before with regard to the shortcomings of the Cal Enviro screen. And I just wanted to see if you can give us an update as to how we're making sure that there aren't communities, and I know Senator Hancock has been concerned with this, some of the disadvantaged communities in her district as well as in mine, that for complexities of the formula don't qualify.
I'm trying to figure out how to suggest that I don't think there are necessarily problems with the current Cal Enviro screen, as we've discussed. I think that it does provide a good, objective, statewide view of communities in California, and using objective criteria help to identify areas that both have a disproportionate share of environmental burdens, as well as facing socioeconomic problems. On the other hand, as we've discussed, we're interested in continuing to bring in new information, continuing to make sure that this is a robust and vibrant document. And so we will be beginning our work on CalEnviro Screen 3.0 this year. I think that the initial workshops will be started in March, and the plan would be to have a new version done by September or sometime in the fall. September was the initial target date. I'll have to go back and take a look at it, but sometime in the fall we would have a new version, and through that process, we'll be able to take into account some of the other factors that have been mentioned to us. And as I said, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is having an objective view of the issues facing all of California, the environmental issues facing California, and then matching that up with these socioeconomic factors that really help us to identify those communities that are going to have a more difficult time responding to those issues, those environmental issues, without assistance from the state. But we are in the process of continuing to work on it.
I know you have been, and I look forward to seeing 3.0. Your description of qualifying communities, I think from those of us who are familiar with on-the-ground existence and challenges of Richmond and some places in Oakland in Senator Hancock's district, or Bayview Hunters Point in my district, obvious communities that are dealing with severe environmental impacts and are low-income communities and fell through the cracks of earlier versions of the screen. So hoping that we're going to be able to improve upon that.
Well, we did Bayview, part of the Bayview's Hunter Point area was in there. Richmond was included in the top 25%, and there was a significant stretch along, particularly along the 880 corridor in Oakland that is considered disadvantaged. And just looking at the allocation of funding that went on based on the use of CalEnviro Screen, I think it's fair to say that in particular, Alameda County lived up to its reputation as a county that knows how to obtain grant funds. But it is, as I've said, what we're interested in is a good system that works and really is reflective of the state as a whole.
Thank you. Secretary Laird, one question for you, and then I'm going to get to some of the other colleagues who have questions. I'd had some conversations recently with some folks from the Coastal Conservancy and from the Tahoe Conservancy, which I know you were instrumental in creating in our days together back in the Assembly, along with Sierra Nevada Conservancy. And they're making the point that some of the projects that you've identified, in particular, I'm just going to focus on one here, wetland and watershed restoration, for example, in the purview of the Coastal Conservancy, that they do that kind of work. And is it more efficient? It would seem to be less so, to be going through Fish and Wildlife to provide grants to these conservancies that are all doing the work. They take a piece of the action. Why would we use that kind of a system as to just go directly to the conservancies, for example?
I think the difficulty is that the allocation has been made for wetlands restoration statewide. And last year, using the entire allocation for the year, 5 wetlands were restored, or there were grants to restore 5 wetlands, and I believe 3 were more mountainous and 2 were near the coast. And it's very difficult to sort of just decide arbitrarily before you go into a statewide process that there's a certain amount that should go for each one, because then it just almost leaves you a limited amount for restoration, and it doesn't allow the statewide look at going based on the criteria of what best meets your greenhouse gas reductions. And I know, because on behalf of the Coastal Conservancy, I chair, I think it's called, I'm the nominal chair. I do this once a year. It's the Southern California coastal wetlands, and it covers Point Conception to the Mexican border. And in the last 10 years, they've expended $600 million on wetlands restoration projects that are there, and it prioritizes those that might be next. And if you're looking at what was 25 million and 5 million 5 projects statewide, you just have a tough time unless you say, well, we'll do one on the coast and one in the mountains, and it doesn't matter if 3 in the mountains are more deserving. You're sort of getting into that kind of process. And I suspect that if this were ever to get to the point that you're doing a substantial amount, then you could start to talk about whether or not you wish to make sure a certain amount went to certain territories, because you'd know that you're meeting the statewide need.
Do you know is there a percentage take for Fish and Wildlife for their expended energies and
Usually,
recommendations?
I just know agency-wide, it's up to 5%, but I know just for some of the bond projects, we weren't even exercising 3%. So they're of a total amount of a cost, and so there's a fraction that goes for
it
administration.
would not be anywhere near 15%, which is a figure I had heard.
No, not at all.
That's reassuring. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Well, we have Senator Nielsen and Senator Monning, Senator Wolk, Senator Mitchell, Senator Allen, Senator Pan. Okay. Senator Borlaug. Got a long list. Go right ahead.
Forget about us. Here, me first.
Yes.
Well, on your latter point, Secretary Laird, I share the concerns about Fish and Wildlife vis-a-vis the conservancies. I've heard quite a few bits of concern about that. I'm going to try to run the table here quickly. I want to keep an eye on that. You know, the meadows, that's an important thing, but they aren't islands unto themselves. You fix meadows, but that has consequence to everything around it. And meadows cannot sustain themselves unto themselves. They have impacts on around them, but they depend on everything around them to sustain. And I think that needs to be accounted for. And there's an awful lot of money going into meadows. So just understand that that's certainly on my mind. And as to the forest and the wetland, or the watershed regions, and now I represented 19 different counties, so I'm very familiar with that. I'm glad to see a strong focus on these lands now. We've accrued and accumulated for decades so much fuel out in these forests. And now when we have fires, they are of such severity that in many cases we sterilize the lands. So now it's become incumbent on us to do a lot more management. And I'm glad to see the amount of discussion about the merits and related to your goals here. And I might add another point to your list, and that's erosion. That's also very important. The erosion that we have just now seen that with these heavier rains that have come this year. So keep in mind that erosion is important. But I'm glad to see that becoming a greater priority for us. And that does have some very immediate effects on carbon sequestration. It's not long-term, and I don't think it's elusive. It's very real. And we then, if we manage our forests and wildlands, we get trees coming back. We don't get brush and more fuel. So that's a very important thing to pay heed to, and I gather that's going to remain, Secretary Laird, a high priority, correct? I must say something amusing related to the methane conversion. I was walking around the Capitol here a few years ago with some friends, telling them about what the dairy industry is doing with Secretary Ross about the methane conversion. And I had a brainstorm. I looked at the Capitol Dome and I said, you know, I bet we should put a methane conversion on that Capitol. That would be certainly a very helpful thing.
No comment.
That was my observation.
You might be eligible for a heat island grant.
That, I'll have to look into that, Secretary Laird. Let's find some budget money for that one. Secretary Kelly, in a recent staff meeting, there was some discussion about the bumpy road, shall I call it, that if those were smooth, that there could be some savings in gasoline. Is that something that's being seriously looked at, smoothing up our roads?